By evening, the Channel sky had turned the color of old aluminum, and a young radar operator in a coastal hut saw a strange slash on his scope, like a knife mark on wet paper. Glitch, he thought. Minutes later, two RAF fighters climbed to check the glitch and heard only a thin hiss, as if a taut string had snapped. The sky seemed to confess, for the first time, that it had a speed limit, and someone had just touched it. In the Second World War, speed wasn't merely a number on a dial. It was a temperament. For some it gave surprise, for others the right to choose distance, for a lucky few a clean escape. Every airplane had its own altitude, its own moment, its own ribbon of wind where it wore the crown. First came the King, who flared like a match. Small, nervous, with knife blade wings, a rocket interceptor roared down the strip, pressed the pilot into the seat, and in a handful of breaths leapt from grass to bomber country. The cockpit smelled of alkali and hot metal. The altimeter spun like a child's top. Wheels were barely up before the machine lived where the air grew thin and hard. It had minutes of thrust, one pass, one shot, then the dead quiet of powerless glide to a landing that could break anything except pride. This King ruled the instant. Flare, strike, vanish. Horizontal races weren't his realm, but nothing climbed with such furious grace. Then another King appeared, cold and smooth as a new razor. A jet fighter cruised over Germany with lazy hauteur. No prop vibrations, no piston rattle, just a steady, confident whistle. Against bombers, it was a knife through bread. Approach, slice, withdraw. Against seasoned prop-driven hunters, things were subtler. Turbines thought longer. Runways asked for gentleness. Approach and landing were vulnerable minutes when the old pistons stalked like wolves. Yet if the contest was a straight, level run of a long, taut string of air, the jet walked away from everyone. It felt as though time had turned a page for good. "Don't bury the prop yet," answered the sea of piston fighters lined up on Allied and Axis airfields. They cut the air with their personalities. One was the long-legged escort, flying high and far, always at the right place at the right time. Another was a heavy hog with a turbo in its belly, diving earthward like a thrown anvil and somehow pulling out, leaving trouble below. A third, a gentleman islander with a griffin in its chest, carved runes in the sky and met danger head-on because any other way was dull. A fourth, the low-road bruiser, prowled where air was thick and decisions were taken on instinct, running down pulse jet bombs until they had no chance left. Each kept a crown on a private shelf, none shared. Up where the thin clouds lived, the elegant bomber guard chose the hour and place of battle and never lost its breath. Down where the wind smelled of wet grass and gasoline, the short-winged mussel grabbed prey by the nape. On sea decks, the bent-winged brute dove with a bell-rope howl and came back as if salt iron were kin. A very late, almost post-war hot rod merely spread its claws. Too late for the ball, yet anyone who watched it launch knew what it would have been one day earlier. Speed, like any power, was capricious. It changed with altitude, wind, fresh paint on a leading edge, even whether the gun ports were taped. Today, the crew chief polished a wing root, and the airplane seemed to shed a sigh. Tomorrow, a radiator door set a shade too open, and the same pilot cursed the air. A logbook can write a neat fastest, but war immediately asks, where were you when it mattered? How many days in a row? How many wingmen lifted with you? One clear spring day over Germany, all these temperaments met. On the deck ran a pair of low-altitude enforcers, hunting launch ramps for flying bombs. Higher, darker, a sleek long-nosed hunter knife down, hit and run. Higher still, almost in the cold light itself, the Jet King drew a straight line like a rule. From the eastern edge of the front, a quick little hawk darted through like a swallow and dissolved. Somewhere between sun and soil, an escort made lazy S-turns above a box of bombers, counting seconds until anything dared climb to touch his heavies. He wasn't the absolute sprinter, but he was always there. Then the sky fell into a spin of numbers, reports, and film frames. People argued and would keep arguing over who should wear the crown. The jet predator that outran all in a straight run. The rocket sprinter who scorched the air in a single breath. The piston knight who wasn't the quickest on the ruler, yet unfailingly arrived on the right height and finished the job. The aerial diary closed its ledger differently. The crown went not only to the one who flew the fastest, but to the one who flew today, often, reliably, whose speed turned, day after day, into guarded columns, living crews shadows brought home. A mechanic in western France had his own theology. At night, he sat by a wing and ran his palm over the dural skin like a horse's flank. Speed is when the airplane trusts its pilot, he said, tightening a cable, and the pilot trusts the people who stood beneath him at 4 in the morning. His pilot usually returned without drama, killed the lights, pulled off the mask, looked up, and only then said thank you. The two of them knew that somewhere higher a merciless jet sovereign had passed, and higher still it was quiet as a library. Their kingdom lived at the height where speed knew how to wait, not only tear. Sometimes on especially clear nights, a veteran jet jockey met a veteran hog in a bar and smiled. Come on, tell the truth. Who was faster? The other lifted his mug. Whoever arrived where he was needed, he said. Both knew the truth wasn't a needle on a dial, but the trajectory of fate. The jet showed the future. The piston won the present. The rocket proved how near we'd come to the edge of physics. And the crown. The crown stayed in the sky, at the altitude where each, for a heartbeat, became unique in his craft, and that heartbeat decided a whole day of war. When peace came, museum curators hung lacquered wings from ceilings, tucked black turbines, and white placards behind glass. Yet sometimes it feels that if you switch off the lights, they wake. The little rocket flares, darts upward, and freezes. The jet glides a straight shadow along the walls. The escort prop makes a quiet circuit, listening for whom to shepherd home this time. Each whispers its own definition of speed. Who was the king? The one who reached your sky in time. The one whose shadow covered you when you looked down at silver ribbons of rivers, dark squares of fields, tiny stations where a boy would someday raise his head and recognize, in the clean air, an invisible crown, a memory of how speed became character, and character, victory. The night after the barroom argument, fog rolled in from the channel and wrapped the dispersal huts like old bandages. A mechanic named Larkin, grease under every fingernail, prayers tucked behind every curse, stood beside a sleeping long-nosed fighter and listened to the fog drip from the wingtips. He spoke to the airplane the way you speak to a horse that knows its own mind. You don't have to be the fastest, he told the metal. You just have to be faster than the problem. Before dawn, the problem arrived as a whistle no shepherd ever wanted to hear. Another flying bomb scratching at the dark. The scramble bell rang like a pan dropped on tile. Two pilots vaulted from canvas chairs, helmets still unbuckled, boots already trusting where pedals would be. Their engines caught with the sullen cough of beasts yanked from sleep, then settled into a purr that promised either triumph or paperwork. They tore the fog like curtains and leveled at hedge height. The pulse jet ahead of them strobed a dirty orange, hopping the hedgerows as if the countryside were a skipping rope. The leader didn't try to close gently. He dove at a rude angle that made stomachs write letters of complaint, then slid alongside the robot the way a sheepdog slides beside a sprinting ewe. There's a trick to not getting your wings shredded by exhaust. You kiss the edge of the heat and nudge, nudge, nudge with aileron and nerve until the bomb's gyros lose their manners. The robot wobbled, tried to be proud about it, then folded into a field with a tired sigh of dirt. Back at dispersal, Larkin didn't say fast, he said in time, and handed up a dented enamel mug. The pilot drank, coughed, grinned. Somewhere a farmer retrieved a blackened cowbell from a crater and wondered which part of London he'd just saved. Far east, where the morning was born sharper, a corsair crouched on a carrier deck like a fist with blue knuckles. The LSO's paddles wagged their delicate grammar of yes, no, yes, and the bent-wing monster jumped the deck with an ungentlemanly laugh. The pilot kept one eye on a ragged edge of cloud and another on an ocean that never learned anyone's name. He'd learned speed differently from the land boys. It wasn't a number to brag about in mess. It was a gap between wave crests, a bar of clean air between flack blossoms, a slice of runway that might or might not show itself before the island did. His enemy today arrived slender and clever, with a prop disc that looked like a halo and a pilot who treated energy like a bankroll. They met in a vertical conversation: climb, roll his past, pull, feel the shoulder sockets complain, then dive where the Corsair was a falling anvil that loved its own weight. They didn't trade shots so much as threats. Speed was the grammar. Angles were the poetry. When the Corsair finally dragged its foe downhill in a thicker air, the blue brute felt like a comet that had decided to be a hammer. The other pilot read the message, broke away low, and lived to try a different page of the manual. That counted as victory enough. Back aboard, the deck gang caught the hook as if it were a wayward thought, pulled the airplane into the tribe, and watered it with avgas. The pilot clambered down with legs that pretended not to wobble. From the island, the skipper's voice came dry through the tubes. Speed is a fine thing. Bring me all of it tomorrow. In Germany, a jet taxied like a cat that refused to acknowledge mud. The ground crew had learned new habits. Don't stand behind it unless you want to meet a version of yourself with fewer eyebrows. Warm the engines like porcelain and beg the compressor gods not to invent new noises. The pilot wasn't cocky. He was tense in the way a violin string is tense. He knew that once he was above the reach of piston snarls, he would be Prince. He also knew that every takeoff was a prayer and every landing a proof of heaven. When he finally slipped free of Earth, the air went to silk. The bomber stream looked like a slow river dragging silver barges. He didn't dive, he arranged. A neat line, an unhurried approach, a burst that stitched daylight through an aluminum skin. He never saw the faces. He heard only his own engine cooling when he throttled back, saw only a gloved hand wiping a fog of sweat from the inside of his canopy. Then, because someone always writes a footnote to your plans, 2 specks below turned into hawks above. Old men's engines, but in the climb they had memorized his airfield. They weren't faster, just more patient. He ran, which for him meant simply doing what his airplane was born to do. The horizon tilted. The specks failed to grow. The sky allowed him to be king for another day. But he landed with a pilot's version of survivor's guilt. The kingdom had borders called fuel and luck. Across France, an escort pilot checked his reflection in the canopy and saw the lines of a man who'd learned to be content with boring. Boring meant the bombers kept their appointments. Boring meant that when the unexpected happened, an attack from above, a knife from the sun, he had the energy to meet it. He didn't brag about top speed. He bragged, if at all, about hours. Hours at altitude, hours with the needle stable, hours of turning mild, lazy S's that could harden in an instant into authority. He saw them before they were beautiful. 2 long-nosed predators, disciplined even in malice, rolling out of the sun with the confidence of men who had won yesterday. He did not think, I am fastest. He thought, I'm where I said I'd be. He flattened, gave his wingman half a syllable of warning, and turned time into a weapon, cut inside the attacker's dive, took one quick shot not for glory but for discouragement, then climbed back like a shepherd dog reclaiming the path. Later, over coffee that tasted like machine oil, he'd shrug off the story. We were on time. That's all. Above all this, above strategy and maps, above speeches and statistics, lived the private lives of speed, the tiny decisions, the rituals, the folklore. AP, 47 driver swore his airplane liked to be insulted before a mission. He'd slap the cowl, mutter, "You refrigerator with guns," and the big radial would reward him by diving straighter than a sermon. A Spitfire pilot believed in socks. Not Lux socks, but dry socks, which, according to him, made a man just light enough on his feet to pull out of anything. He once yanked at 9 blacking out G and woke to find his socks half off and his airplane still flying. He told that story to no one but his mechanic and the moon. A Tau 152 hunter carried a piece of pencil in his glove and, while orbiting a meaningless altitude over a meaningless forest, sketched little birds on his knee pad. When a contrail appeared like a single white hair in the sky, he tucked the pencil away and became the bird that eats birds. Later, landing in a crosswind that made the long wing grumble, he thought, I am faster than winter for 1 more hour. A key, 84 Ace, under a bad sun, tried to teach his rookies that speed was a manner, not a number. He showed them how to enter a fight as if stepping into the shallows of a river, slantwise, testing the stones, then to leave with a backward glance that dared anyone to follow. Privately, he hated the petrol, the shortages, the grit in the bearings. Publicly, he laughed and carved his initials on the weather. A Hellcat returned with half a cylinder bank, missing, and a cowl that looked like it had argued with a piano. The deck crew touched the bent metal the way you touch a wounded friend's shoulder. The pilot, pale as deck paint, whispered to the LSO, "She's slow." The LSO, who had measured 100 kinds of speed with his palms and eyes, said, "She's home. That's the fastest there is." Late in the war, a test field hosted a meeting nobody wrote down. Pilots from different squadrons, some grounded by fuel, some by politics, some by luck, found themselves drinking the same bitter coffee under a windsock that had learned several languages for board. Someone said, "All right, if you had one sky and 1 minute, what would you choose?" The rocket man said, "Give me the minute. I could do a lifetime in a minute." The jet man said, "Give me the straight run. I will make it uncatchable." The escort said, "Give me the rendezvous time and a reason." The deck pilot said, "Give me a deck at the end of it." The low-road bruiser said nothing. He just traced a rectangle on the table, the shape of a field, the shape of a runway, the shape of a promise kept. They all laughed a little, the way men laugh when they admit they've been brave. Outside, a ground crewman polished a leading edge until he could see sunrise in it. He caught his own face, ghostly in the metal, and thought, "I am the speed between wrenches." Peace arrived like an engine idling down, still noisy, not yet trusted. Museums ate airplanes and coughed them up as artifacts. Schoolchildren pressed noses to glass and read placards that tried to pin butterflies with verbs like outpaced, outclimbed, outdived. The veterans stood a little apart and let the kids decide. Now, and then a guide would ask, "So who was the fastest?" And a gray-haired man would smile as if he'd just heard a password from a former life. The fastest, he'd say, depend when you looked. If you looked when rockets burned, then speed was a fuse. If you looked when jets swept the horizon, speed was a straight line no one else could draw. If you looked when pistons still owned the middle altitudes, speed was distance made honest by persistence. If you looked on a carrier at dusk, speed was the inches between a hook and a wire. If you looked from a farmer's field, speed was the moment a robot fell into soil instead of a city. One time, after the museum had closed, a night janitor found himself alone under a suspended fighter. The cleaning cart squeaked like a mouse among lions. He switched off the main lights to mop, and the hangar went hush. For a breath, he could swear he heard metal settling, a deep, relaxed sigh like an athlete lowering himself into a chair after a race. He leaned on his mop stick and looked up. "Who wore the crown?" he asked the dark. And maybe it was the acoustics or the blood in his ears, or the way night hands a man back his imagination. But he thought he heard a dozen voices answer at once. An elegant whistle, a coarse radial chuckle, a turbo's distant yodel, even the prickle of a rocket's breath. They didn't argue. They braided. Whoever arrived, they said. Whoever brought someone home.